Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Marston recording video lecture number 8. By the way, I realize I'm behind on a number of things. I still have to get your TAT responses back. Like I said, they were all very good, but I haven't got them back yet. I will get them back. I was hoping to have them back today. I think it's probably going to be tomorrow morning. Um, and it'll probably be real early your time when I get them back. So it won't be too late tomorrow. Um, the other thing is I wanted to remind you, and this is on the syllabus. You do have a test that is due this week. I will be posting the questions here in. I will be posting the questions here in a little bit, but I can give you till the end of the day. I can even give you till the end of the day Sunday to get them in because I know I'm again late. Everything's been kind of behind here, so I can get those in. Uh, so I'll get those questions up, and as long as you give me your test items by the end of the day Sunday, that's fine. However, I do realize that this is a holiday weekend, and some people, you may want to get them in early. I don't know, because like I said, I do realize that it is a holiday weekend, so that would be fine. Okay, so all right, uh, so yeah, so the test items will be in. The test questions will be up here in a little bit, and I will have your TAT responses back. Just to make you aware, or as to just to point out something that should be obvious. The MMPI 2 exam and the MMPI 2 response paper are due on separate days. I know before we had the TAT responses and the TAT exam due on the same day. And this time, the test will be due this week and the responses will be due next week. I will try to have the responses up early because, like I said, I do realize it is a holiday weekend. Okay. What I want to start with today is to go through some sample MMPI 2 um, interpretations. So I'm going to be sharing the screen here for a while. So let me start this out. Hang on a second. Okay. So what you are now seeing up on the screen uh, is a sample MMPI 2 report. So here's what happens. Um, uh, so what happens is I would give someone the MMPI 2, give them that questionnaire, the set of items, and then they would take the items. They would either fill out the questionnaire as um, by using the pencil where they would fill in the holes, as I showed you, or um, they would take it on a computer. And then both ways, the results would be sent to the testing department of Pearson. Pearson is the company that makes the MMPI 2 and holds the licenses for the scoring system. And then what you would get back is a sample report. And I'm going to go through I'm going to go through this sample reports and some of the other sample reports that Pearson puts out, just to give you um, a general impression of um, what the MMPI 2, what the results look like. Okay, so in this case, this is an interpretive report for somebody who was in an outpatient mental health center. So this is somebody who was tested at an outpatient clinic. In this case, William S. was administered the MMPI 2 at an outpatient mental health clinic as part of an evaluation for marital counseling. He had reluctantly agreed to participate in marital therapy at his wife's insistence after she threatened him with divorce. Some things about him is he has an MBA in marketing from the University of Chicago. He is separated, has two children, ages 4 and 6. His wife is a successful patent attorney. Uh, he's been unemployed for the past 6 months. He was a mid level executive for a major retail firm for 8 years. He had a series of disagreements with several executives at work, including major conflicts with a vice president of the company. He has been experiencing a great deal of marital conflict over the past year, and he had an extramarital affair with one of his wife's close friends for several months. I'll leave this up on the screen so you can read a little bit. Yeah, there's um, uh, his wife returning to the marriage was made contingent upon his entering marital counseling. He's been highly resistant to that in the past. Okay, so by the way, if you look here, it says here the following was a report was generated from Q Global. Q Global is put out by Pearson. This is Pearson, by the way, is the company that does the MMPI too. Uh, and the MMPI basically they work with the University of Minnesota to do all the stuff for the MMPI. University of Minnesota holds the patent, and Pearson is the testing company through which all the interpretive stuff goes. Q Global is a program you can get if you do a lot of testing. You can get a program from Pearson where it's a program that will do the testing, let you um, let you give the testing over a computer, will score it and will give you this interpretive report without you having to send it to a testing center. Okay, so here's the information you get about when you get back a mental health interpretive report. Um, okay, and then here's what you get. Here's the first. Now, the interpretive part of it will be coming up here, but notice what we have here. Uh, you've got high scores. The K score is up high, and the S score. I'll explain that score in a little bit. The S score, the K score are the highest. So notice those are the only two that are above that 65 mark. So you got this, and then you got those are above the 65, and then you've got F that's kind of you've got this one, the TRN that's kind of mildly high, but these are the two that are in the clinical range. Um, okay, and then here's the clinical scales. Okay, and notice the psychopathic deviance scale is the only one that's above 65, above that 65 mark. By the way, MAC-R, this is an alcohol abuse scale. Okay, and then let's go down to these are some of the other scales. Notice, I'll explain what some of these are as we go. So let's get down to the interpretive part, and then I might go back up to the scales. So, um, marginal validity because the client attempted to place himself in an overly positive light by minimizing faults and denying psychological problems. Okay, and um, notice how that is consistent. Um, notice how that is consistent with um, uh, Okay, hang on. Sorry, I had to pause that for a second there. Okay. So, okay. The clinical profile has marginal validity because the client attempted to place himself in an overly positive light by uh, minimizing faults and denying psychological problems. I wanted to go back down here. Notice this word superlative. That's actually what the S means in that S scale. There are a couple profile scales that sometimes are used in the computer program that we haven't covered in detail. But one of them is called the superlative scale, uh, and uh, that's what that measures. It's a scale that measures an attempt by the client to place themselves in an overly positive light by minimizing faults and denying psychological problems. So this first line is actually the sort of the definition of the S scale. So if you're wondering what the S scale is, um, um, that's the definition of what it is. Um, and so um, notice too with the K scale, um, K scale of that high is typically associated with someone who's defensive. And one thing we didn't talk about before, the K scale is actually particularly common, a high K scale with someone who's defensive, who has a high level of education and socioeconomic status, like this individual does. Um, so this is the K scale would be indicative of somebody who is defensive, but also having psychopathology, and the S scale is someone who is attempting to place themselves in an overly positive light. So when you have that, when you have a high K scale and a high F scale, you get this. The clinical profile is likely to be an underestimate of the individual's psychological problem. So basically, what we know all the scale is valid. Notice here this point where it says it's of marginal validity. It is valid. Marginal validity still means valid, but uh, it does tend to suggest somebody who has psychological problems, but is being very defensive. Okay, now let's go down to the symptomatic patterns. Uh, Prominent elevation in PD, the psychopathic deviant scale. The somewhat immature risk taker who may do other things, um, do things others do not approve, or just for the personal enjoyment of doing so. He's likely to be viewed as rebellious. He tends to be generally oriented toward thrill seeking and self gratification. All sort of notice when you get this. Notice if you go back to the hang on a second. Let me pull this up here. If you go back to the text and you pull up the uh, the PD uh, scale. If you pull up that scale, what you will get is essentially. I'm just saying if I can find it. Yeah. Um, okay. Hang on one second. So if you pull up that scale on page, um, so it's if you look up psychopathic diva, um, psychopathy scale 4 was intended to identify, this is from the book, intended to identify asocial and amoral psychopathy. Um, uh, that's how it was developed, but uh, it's with individuals who tend to be, if you look through the description of it, it tends to be something, it tends to be a scale for someone who is who tends to be rebellious. It could be psychopath. The higher the score, the more it's reflective of psychopathology. But it doesn't have to be that. It could be sort of just generally somebody who seeks self gratification, somewhat self centered, narcissistic. So notice how the scale itself, this is a good this is a good indication. One of the reasons I like this example here is this right here. Notice if you go back up to the scale. Oh, you know what? I could just do. I'm sorry. I could just do this. I forgot. Um, Notice here. Okay, I'm going to flip back and forth. Notice here. Um, if you go down here, the only scale you have is so. What I like about this is a summary of what someone looks like, of the interpretation you have when the person is high on the PD scale, on that one scale. Risk taker who may do things others do not approve of just for the personal enjoyment of doing so. Okay. So now now we're getting into some things you get on the computer printout that you wouldn't get elsewhere. Um, the clients, this scale, somebody getting this high a scale on this high a score on that scale, occurred in 9.1% of the MMPI-2 normative group. So when they developed the test, um, um, 9.1% of the men had that as their highest scale, but only 3.3% had scores above 65. So it's a relative, even for a man, it that tends to be a scale, a high score you tend to see most often in men, but even for men, it didn't occur in very many people. All right, and as you go through here, uh, you see some of the other interpretations here. Uh, okay, let me go down to here. Um, this tends to be some of the things. Now notice how this is a reflection of some of the other scales up here. Really just of this one, the FRS scale. And excuse me here, let me just read you the definition of that if I have that right in front of me. Um, no, I don't have that right in front of me. Um, okay, I apologize. I know it's probably going to go back and forth here a little bit, and the reason why it goes back and forth here is I keep wanting to check on some things here, and I realized that I sort of got lost here, but I got caught up. Let me tell you where I got what happened here. So you will notice in all of this, you may well actually you wouldn't know this. Let me point out to you that even though you have these scores up here, okay, you have this one. This is the fears subscale. This is the fears subscale. And notice how it's high, but it's not above 65. It's not very high. So actually, this isn't even interpreted. If you look, this is fears is a scale used to measure when the person has fears. It's basically a measure of things like phobias. If the person has certain specific phobias, they would score high here. Now, um, the other one that was sort of high on this area was up here, and that is this is an alcohol. See, these are all or this one, these three are all alcohol abuse scales, and this one's slightly high. But notice how it's not in the clinical range. So that actually is not interpreted. So what I for the reason I got a little I went off the screen here a little bit is because I wanted to point out to you this part. So the MMPI-2, when you get it printed out, um, it covers different area. Um, tends to be rather likable and personable and may make a good first impression. His tendency is to take personal risks and may sometimes have difficulty maintaining close relationships. Strong need to be out around others, uh, typically outgoing, um, somewhat superficial, may seek attention from others. Now, the reason why I couldn't find what I wanted to point out to you is I've forgotten. That actually is down at the bottom. I was looking back at the scales at the top, but actually, when you get the MMPI2, when you get this printout, some of them are included after the interpretation. And some of the ones where they got those interpersonal style items are like um, dominance tends to be gregarious, outgoing, uh, dominance, authority problems tends to be question of authority. Notice how that psychopathic. This is often what you do. You get these subscales, and then what you look for is the these subscales that tend to break down the meaning of the main score. So psychopathic deviant, you would see that the highest one is authority problems. And notice how um uh and notice up here uh um I'm sorry, inflexible, um, arrogant and intolerant of others' feelings, unlikely to cooperate fully with treatment. That would be a reflection of somebody who has authority problems. So you can see how those subs. So what you have here, when you look at this interpretation, especially this part right here, gregarious and enjoys attention, uh, typically outgoing, but superficial, spontaneous, may seek attention from others. Remember, there was that dominant subscales. And just to take a look at some, well, before I get onto that, notice down here, treatment considerations. Individuals with this profile are generally not self-referred. They typically feel they have very few problems. Um, they may leave treatment prematurely. So those are some treatment recommendations. And I just want to notice how depression, if you want to know if someone's on depression subscale and you want to get a sense of what some of the different types of depression or types of factors that could contribute to depression that describes their depression better, you would use these subscales. So there's a lot of ways that these subscales, as you can see, come into play for clarifying the person's personality and describing it in more detail. Now, what's interesting about, and here there's critical items. So sometimes it includes the results here will also include items where they kind of identify the items that the person endorsed that are really, really infrequent. Um, so, uh, a lot lower than um, 50%. And by the way, since this is a sample, they didn't include all the items on here. I don't find that particularly useful. I think you have to be careful with the critical items. I know they talk about the critical items in the book and in these reviews, but you have to be careful. There really isn't a whole lot of interpretation you can make when it comes to just one item, one or two items on the subscale. Okay. All right. So um, that is an interpretation of the um, for an outpatient mental health client, and that is his MMPI-2. I wanted you to see, you take a look at the scales, then you look at the supplementary scales, and then you make your, you go first by looking at the validity and you figure out what the validity results tell you. And then you move into looking at the main clinical scales and you pull that together and figure out what those scales are telling you. And then what you do is you move on to the supplemental scales, and the supplemental scales sort of uh, fill in the blanks or add detail to uh, the clinical scales. Now, what I wanted you to see when you look at that interpretation, and I hope you caught that, is the clinical scales form the main body of your interpretation. And then the supplemental scales add detail, but you don't really interpret the supplemental scales separate from the clinical scales. So the clinical scales lay your base of what you've got there, what sort of problems a person's having, what sort of main diagnostic issues to consider, what are the main problems that likely are this person is likely dealing with, and that lays your base. And then what you do is you take um, the other um, results, the other scales, and you use that to sort of give more heft to your initial interpretations based on the clinical scales. All right, let's go to another one. Let's take a look at another one here. Uh, let's see what should we look at here? Let's pull up another one. Um, okay, let's look at um, let's go to alcohol drug treatment. Let's see what an alcohol drug profile looks like. Okay, so here we go with this one. This is 18-year-old high school dropout arrested for careless and reckless. So, by the way, you will notice, and I'll even pull this back up here. Notice that the sample outputs that I gave you here. What it is when you send in for interpretation or when you do the interpretation on the Q sort, you get to choose the setting that the testing was at. So some of the choices are alcohol drug treatment center, correctional interpretation report, outpatient, and what it does with those particular settings is it not only gives you results based on the like the overall norms, but it also bases it on norms that they have for those specific settings. And I'll bring that up. I'll show you what I mean here in a minute. Um, High school dropout arrested for careless and reckless driving and possession of a large quantity of marijuana, ran a stop sign and nearly collided with a police car, uncooperative with the arresting individuals. Relationship with his family had deteriorated greatly over the past year. His parents owned a business and Brian worked there during his early high school years. Refused to comply with the rules, so his relationship with his father worsened. At one point, he was accused of taking money from the business. Dropped out of school after a year of failing performance and took a job as a waiter at a fast food restaurant where two of his friends worked. And he was being evaluated as part of a pretrial evaluation. 18, male, never married, 11 years of education. Okay. Notice with the validity scales, it looks like, initial impression is it looks like nothing makes it invalid. Notice how none of them are up here. Remember uh, remember that you're looking at two things here. You're looking at, so what do you got here? You got you got scale 4, so psychopathic deviant is up there, and manic is up there. So you've got scale 4 and 9. Now I'm going to pull up. I actually don't have. I'm going to pull this up right now to see if you look from the book. Remember, we're going through. You look for profiles, and so I'm looking up in the book under profile patterns, and I'm looking to see if 4-9 and 4-9 comes up. So in the book, if you look in your book, under in the chapter on profile patterns, 4-9, 9-4. This would be 9-4, because uh, notice how 9, which is it looks like sometimes a little hard with this because you don't have the graph like you do on the hand scoring sheet, but it looks like oh no, I guess it's 4-9. It's 4-9 because PD is 28. Oh no, wait a minute, that's the raw score. Um, T score, okay, so it's 9-4. Uh, Notice how very similar they look, but uh uh but Mania is 78 T score and PD. Remember, it's a T score. These are the ones that are all the same for each scale. These are different for each scale. The raw score is going to be different for each scale. So a higher raw score doesn't necessarily mean anything on one scale compared to another. But on the T scores, it does, because the T scores are always the same. T scores are equalized. So across all the scales. So you've got 9-4. And here's what the book says about 9-4. Um, Stimulus seeking, intolerant of boredom and frustration, energetic and restless, rule out antisocial personality disorder, mania, lacks motivation for change, but may seek to use therapy to manipulate others, um, defends through acting out and rationalization. Um, okay, and notice here too, this is this max scale. This is the notice what I told you before, that these three are all substance abuse scales. So you've got at or just above the clinical range on two of the three alcohol abuse scales. So it's not looking like, I mean, you've got somebody who probably has some substance abuse problems, which certainly wouldn't be a surprise given his background. But he may be trying to make the case that, he used marijuana and just made a mistake. But these results would suggest that it's more of a substance abuse problem. None of these are in the clinical range. Let's see what the interpretation is. PDM used developed shows very um, uh, impulse control problems. Remember that was in the uh, energetic and restless, um, emotionally unstable, rebellious and impulsive. Um, Extrovert 4-9-4 individuals high on that tend to be they tend to be um, emotionally unstable and dis- disinhibited, but they also um, tend to um, get along with people. Extroverted, self-indulgent. So notice how if you read this, this is almost like a word for word summary of what the material has on the 9-4 profile. So this is clearly the 9-4 profile. Um, Okay, now when we go down to the, notice how it even says on the content scale. So these are the later supplemental scales. Uh, Tendency to reject authority, may have conflicts over rules, doesn't appear to be overly anxious or prone to developing unrealistic fears. This probably means, um, I'm gonna guess up here that that would be, yeah, notice how low. Notice now, now this is something that they're doing that we haven't talked about that much. Um, and you can do this. I mean, you have to do this a bit, you have to do this a bit more cautiously. But notice when they make that specific remark about how the person does not have any specific fears, they are making a specific remark about how low this scale is. It's also a reference to this one, but I don't want to get. Let me just, since I already talked about this scale before, this is the fears scale. This is the one that talks about, that specifically um, relates to things like phobias. And this scale is so low that they are making a specific reference to it. That they're making a specific reference to how um how clear it is that he's not admitting to any specific fears. Kind of, there are some aspects of interpretation that you can use, uh, that I don't recommend putting a lot of weight in. I'll be honest, the critical items to me are bottom of the list. I almost never do those. That can just be too misleading. Uh, none of the scales um, have just two or three items. I mean, they all have multiple items. So to just to have one, even if it's very unusual, I don't think you can have interpretation. I I give a little bit more weight to making interpretations based on scores being low. Um, and usually it's a direct relationship. If it's very low on the depression, it means that they have very little signs of depression. In this case, it's very low on the fears. They talk specifically about how this individual does not seem to at least be admitting to any unrealistic fears. So you can do this. I don't put it in the same category as the critical items. Like I said, the critical items I just mostly will stay away from. But you can, just to make note here, that's what they're referencing here. Okay, and so, again, talking about the profile frequency, interpersonal relationships, so um, superficial and manipulative. Again, that's 9-4. So notice how a lot of it is 9-4. We didn't talk about this very much. So here's another section where they talk about diagnostic consideration, um, personality disorder. The most common diagnosis for a 9-4 is some sort of personality disorder. Um, cyclothymic disorder is like a rapidly changing bipolar disorder. Um, it's interesting that what they're basing that 9-4 in uh, is symptoms of bipolar, which would be what 9 is with the manic scales. But when you throw in that scale number 4, the psychopathic deviant scale, you're getting a real sense of it um, not being your standard bipolar, just more rapidly. It's like when you get 9 and 4 together, it's usually not a clear cut, well defined bipolar disorder. It's sort of like a rapidly changing one, maybe even changing based on the situation that the person finds himself in. And here tends to have a personality characteristics that have been associated with the substance use or abuse problems. Scores on the addiction proneness indicators, possibility of his having an addictive disorder. Notice I pointed those out, the addiction scales. Um, okay, I'll let you. I'll give you just a minute to read this. Um, they usually seek out counseling only at the insistence of another person. They may appear to be cooperative and to enjoy therapy for a time, but they usually resist any demands that they alter their behavior because they are not introspective and see little reason for change. and notice some of the other, notice these supplemental content scales. Let's go down to the specific ones for 9 and 4. 4 would be the psychopathic demon. Where's the real high one? Authority problems. Notice that was mentioned up there. Self alienation. That was mentioned up in the interpersonal relations column. Notice how high that. Notice how high this one is. The authority problems one. What's the 9 ones? The high, um, so if you look here, you get the ego inflation, high view of himself. Amorality tends not to follow social norms. So you can see that here. Okay, and then so you can see how they all tie together uh, with this interpretation. Let's do another one. Let's do what was the one I wanted to do? Correctional jail. Let's do one that was done in a jail. Margaret L. is currently serving a 10-year prison term for a felony conviction for drug manufacturing and possession. She had one drug conviction 3 years ago for which she served a year in prison. She was convicted of producing and selling meth, being evaluated because of possible transfer to a mental health unit. Um, uh, Margaret is complaining of severe anxiety, obsessive, and sleeping problems. Also, she acknowledged having a substance abuse problem. Okay, let's see where this one goes. You go down here, there's Margaret, female, never married, age 27. Okay. All right. So notice now you're going to see this a lot in jail population, which is high. In fact, that's a little unusual to have just one validity scale in the high range. So it'll be interesting to see what the interpretation of the validity. You've just got the one. So it's clearly, I mean, we haven't got an interpretation, but I can tell you just from looking at it, it's going to be valid. So it means you can interpret it. It's not. Sometimes that's a problem in a jail. You get ridiculously high validity scales that just turns out you can't do anything with the results. But that's not the case here. Um, okay. Okay. So those are, I guess, the clinical scales. I think are out of order here. I didn't notice that before. Let me make sure. Oh, okay, we'll get to the clinical scale. Okay. Um, okay. Now there's a number of problems there. It does say the profile is valid, um, and that the client probably feels a need to discuss their problems. Um, uh, okay, so the F scale is interpreted as meaning that she's reflecting a great deal of emotional distress, which certainly could be the case. Um, okay, so this is just some of this initial stuff. Uh, this first sentence is basically a discussion of some statistical analyses that were done because this is a jail population. So they use some um, statistical methods to sort of take into account that there's an excessively large slant on the PD, on the psychopathic deviant scale and the PT scale uh, for jail populations. Now, like I said, the clinical. Hold on, we'll get back up to this, but let's see what the. I want to see what the results were. Okay, so here's the clinical scale. Um, this was on female, and those the male female. So they may make a mark about this because this would be the female, and she's very low on that one. Okay, so notice you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 10 clinical scales. One is very low. So of the remaining nine, she's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 So the majority of the remaining 9 are in the clinical range. The highest being psychopathic deviant again, and I think the next high would be it'd be this one, it'd be the 70. So the so this is the most. So she's got PD dash she's got a 4.7, and that, by the way, the 4.7 is uh the most common profile in a jail setting. And then so let's take a I'm just going to read to you from the book here that I have about what a 4.7 is. 4.7 is a recurrent cyclical pattern of impulsive acting out to relieve tension, followed by periods of self-recrimination and self-control. Um, Tends to have problems with depression and anxiety, um, low frustration tolerance, uh, uh, basically. So, you know, like I said, that 4.7, that's the most common, um, uh, that's the most common one. So when we go back up here, when we go back up to the um, mental health considerations, typically number of persons that have been associated with the substance abuse problems. Okay. But I want to get to, hold on a second. All right. Negative behavior or excessive um, drinking, uh, um, tense, agitated, unable to manage her present problems. Now, what's interesting about this is the validity scale would reflect that she has those problems and that she recognizes it and that she's looking to get some help for that. So this actually would be a scale, um, that validity scale, with the F being a lot lower than you might otherwise expect, uh, is a reflection of actually somebody who, in an outpatient population, that F scale might reflect it wouldn't make an invalid profile, but it wouldn't make an invalid profile, but it would um uh uh but it would call in more questions into how straightforward the person is being. The F scale and the 4.7 um are interpreted specifically in these correction reports. Um, not I mean, they're compared to the general um, norms, but they are also compared to correctional norms. And with correctional norms, those results, that high F score and that 4.7, do not stand out as being as unusual as they would if this were general population results, because they're very common. So the fact that her F score is the only high validity scale, and the fact that her clinical scales are in the are is the profile that's most associated with someone in the jail, is part of the reason that she's not interpreted as having um, psychopathology that would make her unable to get treatment. She is interpreted as having probably even more motivation to be honest about her problems and get treatment than would be typical for someone in the jail. But someone being straightforward and open about their problems and motivated for change in the jail, um, is much different than saying that they're motivated and being open about their problems in the general population. Um, let's look at some of the, without having to go into the definitions of what all these scales mean. Self alienation, notice that's mentioned. Social alienation, notice how those are already. Persecurity ideas. Um, This actually, in a jail setting, persecutory ideas would be interpreted differently in a jail as opposed to, because oftentimes people are out to get you in the jail, or they're looking to hurt you in the jail. So to be sort of suspicious of other people and their intentions would not be unusual in a jail setting. So this would not stand out as much as it would if she were getting that score in the general population. Schizotypal, again, schizotypal doesn't mean schizophrenia. Schizotypal means sort of social isolation, tends to withdraw intensely from other people. Okay, and I think I have time for one more. What alcohol, drug, we already did. Um, I'm gonna pull up the chronic pain interpretive report. A lot of people come in for evaluations if they're in a pain program. They want to know how best to help them. How straightforward they're being about their pain, and so this is an example of one of those reports. Uh, Persistent low back pain, past year after hurting his back lifting jet engine parts. Um, he said that he could not sit or stand without intense back pain. Um, um, uh, So, even though he initially did not miss any work, high school graduate, 2 years technical college, and then spent 6 years in the Air Force. 22-year marriage ended in divorce 2 years ago. Two teenage children who live with their mother. David B., 47, divorced. Validity pattern seems valid. You got a high F here, but not over the clinical range. Let's see what they say about that in the interpretation. Clinical, what do they got? Okay, noticed. Okay, you got a lot of pain complaints here. Um, so um, you got a 1-3 here. Let's see if I can pull up real quick with the before we go into what they said about it. Um, Always like to make sure when I do. By the way, I will do this when I'm doing the interpretation. I will, whether I use the book that we're using in class or some of the other books that I have on the MMPI too, I will make my own interpretation based on the results before I read what they said um, in the interpretation. Because you will notice that in the interpretation, they don't say why they're making this. They go, I'm telling you why they're making, and I guess they do. No, they don't. Uh, um, I don't they don't tell you specifically what results led them to draw those conclusions. So you want to make sure when you're interpreting the MMPI-2 and any test, even if you're using computer scoring and computer interpretation, you want to make sure that if you're ever asked what that interpretation is based on, what the results are. Um, that suggest that. So I always want to make sure that I have a sense of what the results are and what they mean, even before I read what the computer interpreted the results as meaning, so that I know where those conclusions are coming from. Okay, so we've got what do we got here? Is it oh no, that's I'm sorry, what are the clinical skills? Clinical skills I said 1-3, but I'm not sure if it's 1-3 or 3-1. It's 1-1-3. So one is higher than, so 1-3. Uh, is it 1-3? Yeah. So I will read to you. So 1-3 or 3-1. Um, Passive, dependent, complaining, fussy, avoidant of responsibilities, um, rationalizing. And what's interesting here is they make a remark um, that you should check the third highest scale. Now, the third highest scale is not And why they say that is uh, um, the reason they say that is because sometimes there's an interpretation. Usually, the interpretations, if there's interpretation of a pattern, will be based on two scales, but sometimes it's based on three. Now, this one is two scale, and then it's the third. So I don't know that it would count for that because this third scale, the depression scale, is not above 65. But let's just read what one. So 1, 2, 3 would be vulnerable to stress, somatization, um, uh, meaning that there's a lot of focus on physical health and physical function, complaining of aches and pains, preoccupation with somatic symptoms. Now, notice here, this is you got those that the substance abuse. This is a little surprising. I don't know what this, except that. Oh, oh no, no, no. Um, I'm sorry. Um, this would be a warning sign, and why would it be a warning sign? Because this is a pain patient, okay, who's showing a high level um of possibility of some sort of substance abuse. Because if he had back pain and didn't miss work, but then complains he can't say it's that, what would the motivation be if he's not being straightforward? Well, possibly it could be one motivation could be to get pain meds, and you'd have to be concerned about that with this result. Okay, let's anxiety's high. Anxiety's high. You made that clear. Um, he made that clear, although you would also wonder if the anxiety might be high because if those substance abuse scales were reflecting anything, it may be reflective of him seeking out anxiety medications again. He may not now, okay, notice the pattern. Um, uh, okay, reporting a number of vague physical complaints, tendency to develop physical problems when he is under stress. So it could be that the pain is due to stress. Vague physical complaints may not now be greatly incapacitated by his physical symptoms. So the results actually suggest what we know from the reports to be accurate. He's not greatly incapacitated by his physical complaints, but he is complaining about them a lot. So it's not actually carrying over to interfering with what he's actually doing, except that his focus is very intense on them. Um, knows high endorsement of general anxiety. Um, so that's another problem. I forget, did I pull up what these? Oh, validity. Yeah. Profile is probably valid. Cooperative, enough. Okay. Let's, um, suggest okay. Now I want to get down to diagnostic considerations. Okay. Look at this. Um, reported number of specific physical and psychological symptoms. Organic problems need to be ruled out. His personality makeup is consistent with a psychological basis to his symptoms. That's what that 1, 3 reflects there. But notice this. Notice what we're talking about. High scores on the addiction proneness indicators. Okay. Um, Acknowledge some problems with excessive use or abuse of addictive substances. So notice what we've got here. We've got someone who seems to have um, a lot of vague physical complaints that may have an organic basis, but may also have a psychological basis. And he's showing a proneness towards substance abuse. So this would have to be somebody to be very, very cautious of with regards to possibly pill seeking. Um, he may not be amenable to psychological treatment. May not be amenable in part because he may be looking to get medication. He may be receiving secondary gains from them symptoms from his symptoms. Uh, at the very least, we know that he seems to be somebody whose symptoms of pain tend to exacerbate if they're under stress. Okay, so his acknowledged problems with alcohol, drug use should be addressed in therapy. Um, and when they say acknowledged, one of those scales, I apologize. One of the ones he was high as far as an addiction scale, is a scale that's actually meant to. I mean, it's the person being pretty open about substance abuse issues. They're pretty and again, I apologize, I forget which one it is, but one of them is indicative that he's, if you get a high score on it, it's basically you admitting to having substance abuse problems. Um, okay, so I wanted to give you some examples. Let's look before we go here. Uh, mental dullness. Notice how high mental dullness is. So it tends to be sort of like flat, like depression, not as a depression more as giving up as opposed to being very sad about something. Somatic complaints are at 77. Okay, good. All right. Okay, I think it's enough for now. I'll post the test questions here a little bit along with the articles for this coming week, and let me just hold on a second. Yeah. Oh, sorry, sliding it back while I was off screen here. Okay, I'll see you all on Thursday. Take care.